I'm Chris O'Brien, the director of the Theodore Roosevelt Center here at Dickinson State University. For those of you who are joining us in the room for the first time, for those of you who are joining us elsewhere in the country or around the world, welcome aboard for a lovely evening with the Poet Laureate of North Dakota, our final session of the day. A little bit of housekeeping, tiny bit. Tomorrow, for those of you who are headed to Medora, you don't have to ride the bus. You can meet us there. That'll be fine. You don't even have to tell me. I'd be happy to see you there. If you want to ride the bus, it's on the schedule. I don't know what the schedule is, obviously, if you've asked me anything about it today. So, but some of those other people do. I'm here in my official capacity to introduce the introducer this evening. That is the Chancellor of the North Dakota University System. That's Chancellor Mark Hagerott. A little bit about Chancellor Hagerott, who served a long career in the United States Navy. And as an academic, it's Dr. Hagerott from University of Maryland. We taught for many years leadership roles at the U.S. Naval Academy, planning and strategy director at the largest U.S. Army educational organizations, the NATO training mission, which included training the Afghan Army, police, Air Force, medical school programs, distinguished professor, deputy director of the Center for Cybersecurity, a nuclear engineer, and a historian. Just those things. In his free time, he runs the North Dakota University System. So I couldn't be more honored to turn over the podium to Chancellor Hagerott.
Thank you. Well, I didn't think I'd get such an introduction as just the introducer. But I just got to say this about Dickinson. What a gem. I don't know if people know my uncle actually graduated from Dickinson. It just was, he'd lost his mother at an early age, and it became a real family for him. And so, unfortunately, he died at a relatively young age of a heart attack himself. But I remember him talking about how Dickinson, you got to go to college, it becomes your family, they take care of you. So thank you for taking care of Virgil Bolt some 45 years ago. But my job is to introduce our Poet Laureate, Dr. Denise Lajimodiere, and she talked to me about the French pronunciation. Her family is just fascinating. There's books written about it. I'm just going to talk about her own achievements, but truly quite a historic family. Originally from Canada, which was fascinating to learn that her family sought refuge in the United States from Canada when the British Army was trying to hunt down her relatives. So many generations ago. But Denise is an enrolled citizen of the Turtle Mountain Band of the Chippewa, Belcourt, North Dakota. She's been involved in education for 44 years. Thank you for preparing the next generation. My wife was a K-12 teacher, but elementary teacher, principal, professor, no more important role than preparing the next generation. Earning her bachelor's, master's, doctorate degrees from the University of North Dakota, our other known university to the east here. Dr. Lajimodiere is now retired associate professor from the School of Education Leadership Program at the North Dakota State University in Fargo. And she's one of the founders of the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, which, though you know the history, there's quite a legacy, and that's very thoughtful of what you've done there in your spare time. That she's also a poet and has written several pieces, just a few here, The Dragonfly Dance, The Thunderbird, Bitter Years, His Feathers Were Chains, and then children's book, Josie Dances, and with 3 granddaughters who love their books, I'm going to have to look for some of those. And then book author of Stringing Rosaries, The History of the Unforgivable Healing of the Northern Plains Boarding School Survivors. So you can see why she basically was named the North Dakota Poet Laureate. And she is the first Native American to hold that position, finally, after 130 years. But in addition to that, so teacher, administrator, historian, scholar, poet, but she also is a dancer. But you're not going to dance tonight, I take it. Is that right? No dancing tonight. Ojibwe bark-biting artist as well. And she's got her current home, when she's not here in Dickinson, the Badlands, is a cottage by the lake in the Turtle Mountains. So thank you for joining us, and please welcome our Poet Laureate.
Bonjour, Anin, Wabishka Bene Sawanakwat, Ikwe Dijinakaz. My tribal name is White Thundercloud Woman. Mikanak Waju Nindunjiba Ashkunigan. I'm from the Turtle Mountain Reservation, also in our language called Ashkunigan, which means leftover land. Ashijak Nido Dame, and my clan is the Crane clan. So, Mingwich Kakina Awiya, thank all of you for coming out tonight on a chilly Friday night. I want to thank Chris for the invitation to speak tonight. I wasn't quite sure what I was getting myself into, but it's been an interesting two days. I've learned more about TR than I've ever known in my life. Often presentations were in an academic language and jargon that sometimes I didn't know what they were talking about, but they were brilliant, brilliant presentations. Joy Harjo was the first female national poet laureate of the U.S., and I love her work. She says, "We are the storytellers. We hold the stories of the earth." So the poetry that I read mostly has to do with who I am as a Native person. She says that poetry is an art form of self-expression. Storytelling for me is a big part of my cultural identity. And it's also, if you read any of my poems, a big part of therapy, very therapeutic for me. And so my poems are often autobiographical, but not always. So Joy says that poetry is made to hold that which is too heavy for humans to hold. Poems can contain our grief, remorse, fury, even as they can reveal joy, celebration, and delight. So I try to incorporate all of that in my poems. So I've been changing my poems order even during lunch and even before I came up here. So the first poem I'd like to read is my first book is published in 2010. And it's called Dragonfly Dance, and we were just talking to some of the people in the audience about dragonflies. But the dragonfly did something to me a while back, and I'll read that poem now. Dragonfly Dance. Suspended above our plumed and feathered heads, the dragonflies join us for grand entry at Red Lake, the sun striking flames from their sapphire wings, these winged mounts of ancestor spirits, returning to heal. I move in step with the drum. I dance with the dragonflies as one drops down to gaze into my face with its lovely bright eyes. I hold its gaze, this holy creature, spirit of the water, born of the water as I am. Life, birth, power of love made constant. She spins her beaded body to join the dragonfly dance as my wings join their rhythm, my feet vibrating. You don't have to clap, by the way, after some people don't know what to do, but you could, but if you want to. There you go, yeah. So my poems, I learned a lot from Dr. Larry Y. Woody. He was the previous poet laureate for 30 years. I took his classes at UND. So I learned about sestinas, villanelles, prose poems, end rhyme poems, blank verse, and sonnets. When I first went in to visit Larry, I came from being a hippie in Portland State University in the late 60s, and the poet professors there, he said, we're not going to do any of that. We're just going to do like free verse. So when I went in to talk to him, I said, well, I just do free verse, as if I knew what I was talking about. And he looked at me, he says, well, in order to do free verse, you need to know the rules, and then you can break them. It really helped me a lot. So I've learned to write in all forms. So I was just mentioned that I was a hippie. Page 35. And I was at a poetry reading at UND, and the gal that was reading the poems at that time, she said, well, everybody has to have a hippie poem. So this is my hippie poem. I grew up in the East Coast from the time I was 6 until I was about 19. I did my first 2 years at Portland State University, right in the midst of a lot of stuff going on in the late 60s, early 70s. Portland, 1970s. I walk barefoot on the hot cement, downtown heat spews a rotten scent, with hair long, eagle feather tied tight, and bone choker, fringed vest, bright beads. Hey cousin, spare a dime? Toss it here, yellow jacket, blue cross. Sure, buy a lid for $10, super groovy, and stoned watching Soldier Blue movie, crying at the song by Buffy St. Marie, a sense of pride, she's Cree like me. Custer died in an arrow shirt, that's Indian power. Lizzie waits in the fort's phallus-shaped tower. The treaty said as long as the grass grows, and BIA means kiss my big Indian ass. Wounded Knee, 73, the taking of Alcatraz, fishing rights, the Army engineers, dammed the mighty river, no salmon here. At Cook's Landing in Washington, the Coast Guards rammed the elders' tiny fishing boats, and BIA stands for Boss Indians around. Don't rock the boat, shut up, don't make a sound. Honky, go home. Go home and pack, give us our land back, just give it back. Hell no, we won't go. Tricky dicky, make love, not war. And I'm a hippie living in a commune, stoned on free love, morning, noon, and night, blowing smoke above the barn where I'm high on sweet goat's breath and leading anti-war marches, no more death. Peace sign, flower power, a daisy for your gun, tattered jeans, hiking boots, keep on trucking, peace bro, peacefully pissed off, and the body bag count grows. Commune men flee to Canada. We march for women's liberation, black power, dashikis flow, gay liberation, a pretty flower. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Rama. God as a crutch, smoke a bowl, groovy, far out. Can you dig it? Can you roll a joint? I'm getting low on my stash. We're marching to get our heads bashed. Two white men, suits and ties standing behind me. Barefoot in feathers. She must be an Indian. So there was a program in the mid-1950s called Relocation, and it was another program of assimilation. The government wanted to get us off reservations and into the cities. So, and my father learned to be a carpenter at the Chemawa Indian Boarding School, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. So, but he couldn't make a living in North Dakota as a carpenter. You know what the weather's like here back in the 50s and so on. So we moved to Portland where he'd be able to work year-round. But we would come back to the reservation most summers. And I absolutely loved North Dakota, and I never wanted to go back home. But I think because they were boarding school, they wouldn't leave me with my grandparents and cousins on the reservation. I always had to go back to Portland. So this is on one of the trips that we made back to North Dakota. And this is a prose poem, for those of you that might have English degrees. But so it's called Sweetwater Well. The paved road ends. The paved road abruptly ends, and we roll in a choking cloud of dust into Cannonball. My sticky mouth coated and dry, Grandpa waves to us from his tar paper shack. We'd driven from Oregon to Cannonball, North Dakota that summer I was 11. The stifling heat made bearable only by frequent stops for orange pop. I cheered at the sign entering the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. Tanshi Kia, Pepistique, Shamak, he shouts in Cree. Strange how no one questioned these Crees living with the Sioux, caught in a winter blizzard on their way north and offered the church sanctuary. They never left. It helped that great-grandma was a medicine woman. Hearing of the sick, she gathered herbs, roots, leaves, and bark from the rich river bottomland. Put in a glass of water, if the medicine moved in a circle, it was right for you. I run to the well, toss off the cover, pull the rope hand over hand, and slurp the cool, sweet water from the mikwan until my stomach is full to burst and water spurts from my nose. As great-grandma fired up the wood stove to make coffee, I snuck down to the Missouri River until I heard my dad yelling and caught hell because of rattlesnakes. In the hissing of the kerosene lamp, I lay down on the blanketed wood floor, drinking in the sweet flow of Cree. So this is my latest book. His Feathers Were Changed came out a couple years ago. I think during the pandemic. I think 3 of my books came out during the pandemic, so kind of cut short my little book tour. So this one is this is about my kukum or my grandma. And it's a sestina. Slow time. She rises to stoke the old monarch stove, her place in the bush more cabin than a house. Puts a pan of water on so I can wash my face, get dressed, and then head out to school, where I'll teach 4th graders reading and times tables. She puts on her calico dress and well-worn apron, sewn from torn clothes others have worn. She will busy herself about the stove, getting ready for lunchtime. She still chops wood, stacks it by the house, and waits my return from school, combs her hair, puts rouge on her face, pins her curls, and she's ready to face the day. Same as before, rutted and worn as the reservation road I take to school. She sits on her couch, away from the stove, listens to the quiet of her house, shuffles cards, and thinks about old times. The wringer washer needs filling, hard time carrying water from the nearby slough, facing an uphill climb, winding back to the house, through trees, leaves ticking, the path well worn. To boil water, she puts more wood in the stove. The cool stream greets me when I return from school. I help hang clothes on the line as the school bus rattles by, kids waving. When it's supper time, she brings in a load of wood and feeds the stove, makes rubaboo and fry bread. I feed my face while she puts her tea kettle on the stove, worn out from work inside and outside the house and thinking of days gone by. She houses many memories, wishes she had gone to school past the 3rd grade. Sitting in the worn corner of her couch, she calls evenings slow time. Shuffles her cards that no longer have faces, while boiling drops dance like tears on the hot black stove. Nighttime, we listen to the snaps in the stove. As the house cools, she schools her cards, faces absent, shuffling, worn. So, yeah, thank you. So she lived out in the bush in a cabin that didn't have running water, had an outhouse, and spent a lot of time in the evening. And she just, we listened to, as opposed we listened, and she had said that nights for slow time. So now, I'm not quite her age when she was, but I also live in a cabin by a lake, but I have running water. There is an outhouse out there. Don't use it. So it's just kind of like life circling around. I'm starting to, and evenings are like slow time for me now at my age. So, okay. Oh, this one's So I was asking TJ, how come you write a book about Custer, hey? Like, what for? So I forgot I have a poem about Custer. So how many of you have been to Fort Taunton? The fort, yeah. So it was a fort. Custer was at the fort. And then it was a boarding school. So I do a lot of research, and I have some poems about the boarding school too. But this is a story that someone told me while I was doing some research at Fort Taunton. They let me go all over Fort Taunton where tourists can't go. The 2 young people that work there. So I'll sit up in the old boys' dorm and write poems. They let me see what's behind locked doors. If I see anything in the fort that looks like it could be opened, they let me open up, and I crawl around and so on. But this is a story that came out of Fort Taunton. Let him win. Custer the dandy, dressed in blue-gray flannel shirt, knobby buckskin trousers, tucked inside spit-shined high jack boots, pranced into Fort Taunton on his horse, Vic. Came to inspect his 7th Cavalry assigned to protect the U.S. boundary. Fort Taunton, located in desolate Dakota Territory, a crumbling hellhole, blazing summers, blasting bitter cold winters, drunken soldiers and high-ranking officers thrown in jail below the barracks, facing court for failure to perform military duties, sobered up and stood at attention as a band played Gary Owen. It was Custer's luck to win at poker. Captain warned his men to let him win, but a young lieutenant played his cards and won. Custer sent orders for him to stay when the 7th Cavalry reported to Fort Lincoln in preparation for fighting the Sioux on the Little Bighorn. A month later, the soldiers stood at dark attention as Comanche, a paint horse, survivor of the showdown, walked into the fort to be retired from battle. The chase over, last bugle call, gate closed. So often what I need to do, and what a lot of poet friends do, is research for their poems. So I researched poker games, and that's what they would say at a poker game. The chase is over, last bugle call, gate closed. But it certainly fit into the poem as far as Custer. So that's my Custer poem. So a lot of my poems have, the title of the book comes from a poem within the book. So His Feathers Were Chains, the cover, those of you that have it, it's an actual picture I had taken at a motel in South Dakota while I was driving on my way to Pine Ridge to interview a gal there for my dissertation. So I actually had to go and find a farmer to tell me what all of these things were. So it's within the poem. And so this is from North Dakota State University. And my editor, wonderful editor, Suzanne Kelly, we went round and round about the cover. She got stuck on feathers and wanted to have the cover be just different kinds of feathers, turkey feathers and different things. I said, no. So I said, listen to the poem and look at the picture. So then she sent this off to an artist that works with the press, and he came up with this beautiful, beautiful painting. I just absolutely, of course, turquoise is one of my favorite color. So that's the story behind the cover. His feathers were chains. At a small town in South Dakota, I stopped to rest and saw an Indian on a horse, welded together using farm implements and planted on the land on the lawn next to a Sioux motel. His war bonnet was a sickle bar, his shield a disc blade, his feathers were chains. A splicer connector formed his mouth into a permanent oval. His horse's body was a barrel. A harrow for a tail, his hoofs support brackets. I found him there and heard a war cry from his mouth like howls in my chest. Is one a warrior only when revelry is heard? Forgive me, friends, but he was there at Wounded Knee, Little Bighorn, Washita, Sand Creek, and Whitestone Hill, and has a harrowing tale to tell. Staked to this earth, his feathers were chains, his blood a rusty red. Yeah, I like that. Okay. So I do, let me take a drink first. I interviewed my folks about their boarding school years along with my grandfather's, and I decided as part of, as a professor you have to publish our parish, that I wanted to do a qualitative interview study about boarding school survivors after listening to my mom and my father. My mom died when I was 24, so I didn't get a chance to visit as much with her about her boarding school experience. I interviewed my grandfather when he was like 84, back in the mid-'80s. And then my father passed away, and he was 77 when he passed away in '93, so I have an interview of him. So that's what this book is about, is the stories of people I interviewed. So I wanted to interview you from the time you were born till you went to school, from the time, and then what was your life was like at the boarding school, and then what was your life now, after boarding school. So that's the story here, and then there's themes that came out of that and so on. But I wanted to do an academic book. There's some books out there that had vignettes, but I wanted to do an academic book about the legacy of boarding school in the United States. So the book came out a few years ago, and then something sad and remarkable happened in Kamloops, Canada. Is anyone familiar with what happened up in Kamloops? With they didn't discover unmarked graves. The elders there knew, because when they were in the boarding school, they saw bodies being buried out in that graveyard, but they were unmarked graves. This coming Friday, I'm going to Fort Taunton with some professors and the State Historical Society, and we're doing a ground-penetrating radar, or LIDAR, over where elders have told me that they saw kids being buried at Fort Taunton boarding school. So it hit the national and international news. It's 2.5 years ago. It was 2 years ago in June. So I've been doing boarding school research since 2011. There was only a couple of us in the United States. So I'm considered one of the leading experts on boarding schools. I helped organize, I was one of the founding members of the National Boarding School Healing Coalition. So from 2011 to now, we've been trying to bring this issue to national attention and to the Congress. So then it's sort of like a perfect storm happened. Kamloops happened, and our brothers, our relatives across the medicine line said, well, you better look to the United States, because the same thing happened there. And so news media found my book and started contacting me all over the world. I got calls from China, Al Jazeera English, Australia, New Zealand, ABC Nightline, and hundreds of, well, not hundreds, but about 100 magazines and radio, podcasts, and so on. I was asked to speak at conferences from California, Nebraska, Atlanta, and so on. So my book was in place. The National Boarding School Healing Coalition were in place in Minneapolis, and Secretary Deb Haaland had just gotten her job in the Department of Interior, which were historically the ones that funded the boarding schools and funded 14 different Christian organizations to run the boarding schools. So that's been quite remarkable. So now, Elizabeth Warren, there is a bill that we're trying to get through Congress called the Truth in Healing Act. And that will establish a committee to go through the United States and take stories from boarding school survivors, but also to look at what does healing from boarding school trauma look like. It's the Boarding School Healing Coalition. So I have a few poems about boarding school from interviewing father and relatives and other people. So this is a chapbook called Bitter Tears, and it was published by, it's a small publication company called Mammoth Publications. And it's mostly vignettes, but some of my original poems and stories about boarding school. So this is called Bitter Tears. And this is about Chemawa in Oregon, where my father was sent. The school's maintenance man drives me to the cemetery, unlocks a sagging gate under a wrought iron arch. Stark letters, Chemawa Cemetery, 1886. Ancient fir trees tower above the graves. Weeds and wildflowers cover the small, flat plaques. Offering tobacco prayers, I gently sweep aside the weeds to read the names and the years they died. What did they die of? Loneliness, worked to death in the barns and fields, pneumonia, a beating from the gauntlet, suicide on the tracks in front of the school. I count 21 plaques in a row with the date 1918, the year of the flu epidemic. I find plaques stamped with the years my father was a student there. Did he know this boy, that one? Were they friends? As a carpenter apprentice, did he hammer together the casket they were buried in? Was there a funeral? How were their parents told? Sap seeps down a fir tree's trunk like bitter tears, its roots tugging at a plaque, holding a lone child in embrace. I brace against a tree and weep for the children, for the parents left behind, for my father who lived, for those who didn't. This is my grandfather. It's the story he told while he was at Fort Taunton. My grandfather was a new initiate. My grandfather was a new initiate at the Fort Taunton Indian boarding school. He was told he had to steal a can of tomatoes, a sweet fruit to these hungry little boys in the dorm. Down the cement stairs, past the headmaster's studio with its own bath, into the Dakota dark, he stumbled across Calvary Square to the outside kitchen shed door, fumbled for the hanging string, down the narrow stairs, grabbed the heavy can, and lit out into the steel arm of the headmaster. They brought me to a magazine room where a barrel was strung across. I had to lay over it, and two bigger boys held my arms. The little boys had to watch. The headmaster whipped my bare back with a rubber hose. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't catch my breath. I passed out. At Fort Taunton today, red bricks crumble beneath white paint. Name plaques on the buildings recognize its days as a fort and then a boarding school. Standing inside the black powder / flower storage room, it's small, maybe 10 by 10. How did all the boys fit in? As I stood and wept, the hot July winds gathered forces from across the plains and hurled like warriors into the square. An arrow soaked in gunpowder, lit, aimed, and the room exploded around me, the bricks a liquid red. So I talk a lot about my father, and I'll read in a moment. I'm writing a middle grade novel as we speak, have been for a little over 2 years. It's loosely based on my father's experience at Chemawa boarding school in Oregon in 1925. So I have 291 more words to write, and it will be at 30,000, which is what my editor wants. So hopefully by the end of the week, I can send that off, and it's called Tree Popping Moon, but I'll read an excerpt from that. So I mostly talk about Papa, but this is my mom. I thought, well, I got to write more poems about Mama. She was sent to Stevan, a Catholic boarding school in South Dakota, and also Wapton, where I learned that she ran away. After Papa died, I went to the archives, the federal archives in Sandpoint, Seattle, where they had his records, his letters from home, and his report cards. And I did not know how I would react until I sat there and the archivist came and brought me his file. And I just wept. It was hard to read the letters from home. They were so sad. And see his grades, and he didn't speak a word of English when he first got to boarding school. So he was beaten for that, and lye soap put in his mouth until he said, I just couldn't learn that English. He spoke pure Cree. His mom died in the 1918 flu epidemic. So Grandpa must have been, I think, like 21 years old with two toddlers. So he gave my father to an old Cree couple to raise him. So I'll read his story in a bit. So this is Mama's story. So Richard Pratt, he only wanted women to do domestic work. I learned to be housewives and to just get married. That was all that he encouraged the women to do. So this is at boarding school. At boarding school, Mom learned to knit. I'd hold a skein of yarn in my arms, sway back and forth while she wrapped it into a ball. At boarding school, Mom learned to embroider. Kitchen towels held names, one for each day of the week I used when washing and drying dishes each night. At boarding school, Mom learned to darn socks. On quiet winter nights, sitting by a lamp, head bowed over a light bulb with my white cotton sock stretched over it, carefully weaving frayed edges together. At boarding school, Mom learned to wash clothes, worked in the school's laundry, bluing the whites, ran clothes through the mangle, careful not to catch an arm, then hang on clotheslines. At boarding school, Mom learned to sew, made all my clothes, even when I complained that the kids made fun of me. My homemade skirts, dresses, pants, and darn socks, saying we were poor. She sewed aprons, over-the-head bibs, wrap around the waist everyday calico ones, gauzy frou-frou ones for the holidays, starched stiff with sheer pockets, fancy hanky tucked in, wide ribbons to make a bow. At boarding school, Mom learned to clean, detailed to bathroom toilets with a toothbrush, washed walls, scrubbed corners on hands and knees, scraped dirt from corners with a butter knife. At boarding school, Mom learned to cook, and every day at home donned an apron and baked and cooked and baked and cooked. On holidays, she wore the fancy sheer frou-frou apron with wide starched ribbons, hanky tucked in pocket, embroidered with exquisite lace, hands aching stiff from arthritis, had me tie a pretty bow. At boarding school, girls were taught to be domestic servants, trained to be housewives. They didn't have a choice. Nuns stood stern with ruler in hand. My mother mastered the art of housekeeping. Mom taught me how to knit and darn and embroider and wash and hang clothes and sew aprons, iron, wash walls, scrub floors, scrape corners. Exhausted, I refused to learn to cook. The ghost of Richard Pratt whispered in her ear, and she told me I would never find a husband. So I would say, don't tell her, but I found a couple. I have just one. I think I'll do one more from here. I gotta find it. Looking for, I wasn't going to read this one, but I think I will if I can find it. Okay. This is called Identity Crisis. So when I grew up in Portland, Oregon, so I was there since I was 6, and Mom and Papa were pretty well forced to be assimilated at boarding school and made ashamed of being Indian. Even though we go back to the reservation, I learned nothing about who I was as a Native person, who I was as an Ojibwe person or Métis or Michif, no language. Grandma, though, my grandmother helped raise us. She didn't speak English. She didn't like speaking English, so she would talk our native language to Mama, and Mama would answer in English. And my father, after boarding school, he never spoke another word of Cree in his life. So I didn't know truly what it was to be Native, our spirituality, dances, our culture, our traditions. I didn't learn any of that while growing up, not until I moved back to the reservation when I was 19 I was about 20 to start school again. And I started learning more once I was on the reservation, of course, the ceremonies and language and so on. So this is called Identity Crisis. In 4th grade, the nun wanted to know what nationality I was. So I asked Mom, tell her you're Indian from the Turtle Mountains. So I told the nun. She smiled hard, sucking in air. Oh, so you're Indian from India? Yes. She brought me brass elephants, incense holders, and books to write a report for the class. I can still see the B+. The kids believed me, called me squaw, jerked my braids, Woo woo, stinking Indian savage. She has germs, tag, now you're it, you have her germs. In middle school, I was Chinese. In high school, Polynesian. Although I told the history teacher my father was Indian and attended the very boarding school she mentioned. So your father was a chief? All eyes shot towards me. I nodded yes. The Portland Indian Center waved me in, and I was taken in by the American Indian movement, Indian power, fist pumps, marches, and demonstrations, tied an eagle feather in my hair, wore beaded fringe that ticked and swayed, bone chokers, soft-soled moccasins, glared at white folks who dared to stare. One day, I heard the drum at Delta Park, saw the butterfly dance, calico dresses, winged arms spread wide, feet lightly touching the earth. I saw the owl dance and the war dance, the white buckskin-dressed men, regal. Time stood still as I watched the dancers' moccasin feet patting the earth. I couldn't breathe for the beauty. In the shadow of teepees, I tried to capture the steps. The drum stopped and I overstepped. How did they know when to stop? My first dance outfit was a butter yellow wool flannel shawl, soft buckskin dress found in a reservation trading post, pink shell earrings, braids wrapped in fur West Coast style, Apache moccasins I copied from a Geronimo poster. Elders told me, listen to the drum. It is your heartbeat. The drum will tell you when to stop. I listened to the drum's heartbeat and danced. I danced the rabbit dance at Turtle Mountains, crow hop at Fort Yates, danced to achingly beautiful 49er hand drum songs that brought out the northern lights over Newtown one warm August night, joined fancy shawl dancers at Fort Taunton. Then the jingle dress dancers of Red Lake gifted me a medicine dress, and elders counseled me. You are Anishinaabe Ikwe. This is a healing dress. Dance zigzag to chase away all that's not good. Don't dance backwards or your life will be backwards. Tangle your jingles and your life will be tangled. Spin in circles and your life will spin in circles. I listened to the drum. I danced zigzag. I couldn't breathe for the beauty. I danced. I stopped on time. So I'm going to read chapter 4 from my book, Tree Popping Moon, loosely based on my father's experience, and then I have a final poem. This is his story. This is a 9-year-old boy. I'm outside, and I have all kinds of edits already on this. Chapter 4, Indian Agent. I'm outside playing with my newly carved birthday animals, Mushum and Kuko, my grandparent and grandmother in Cree. I'm outside playing with my newly carved birthday animals, Mushum carved. Bright yellow finches dart in the tree overhead. Chickadees call out, chickadee-dee-dee. It's a warm summer day in August, or the medicine moon. Woodpeckers sound like little powwow drums in the distant trees. The air is soft and full of the scent of sage and prairie roses. The aspen tree leaves tick quietly in a gentle breeze, and the sunlight on the lake sparkles like the mica Mushum used to make the eyes for the animals he carved. Suddenly, I hear Kukum shout at me from inside the cabin. Her voice sounds different, frightened, and urgent. Pimbasta, Nushishim, Pimbasta, run, grandchild, run. Through the trees, I see a sleek black car coming down the road. I grab my animals and sprint into the thick willows and aspen trees behind the cabin and lie down flat, my heart thumping. I know it is the Indian agent and an interpreter. They come from the United States government. They are looking for kids to send away to the white man's school, where you have to live and sleep. You cannot come home at night to your family. These men come every year as the leaves are changing. Mushum and Kukum didn't want to send me away to boarding school. They've heard other children's stories of hunger and even beatings. Children come back only speaking English, scared to talk Cree, Michif, or Ojibwe. Worse yet, they never came back. I hear the agent yelling at my grandparents, and I hear the interpreter's soft voice, but I can't understand what they're saying. Soon I hear the sound of a car door slam. I wait a few minutes before Kukum calls out, Ashtam, Ashtam, come. I sit down at the table with Mushim and Kukums. Tears flood their eyes. If we don't send you to school, the Indian agent will take all our firewood and stop our food commodities, and worst of all, we'll be put in jail. It's the law, Mushim said sadly. I lie in bed that night, unable to sleep. Fear makes my stomach hurt like the time I stumbled and fell on a log. What will happen to me? What school will I be sent to? What will happen to Mushim and Kukum without me to help them? One morning, soon after, I wake up to find a small suitcase packed and Kukum weeping. I panic and run to my hiding spot in the bush. Mushim comes to fetch me and quietly walks me back to the cabin. You must be brave, my boy. We'll be here watching and waiting for you when you return. Then the Indian agent drives up in his black government car that looks like a hearse. When the agent comes in, I scream and cling to Kukum. I'll be back. I'll run away, I say, sobbing. She hugs me tight. Kisakia tin nushishim. I love you, my grandson. Be brave. Without saying a word, the Indian agent grabs me out of Kukum's arms, jerks me out of the cabin, and roughly throws me into the car with my suitcase. My cries blend in with Kukum's wails. As we drive away, I look back and see Kukum collapse, Mushim holding her up. My chest hurts. I slump down on the seat. Through tears, I watch as the Indian agent drives out of the Turtle Mountains onto the prairie. He doesn't say anything as I scream and kick the back of his seat. I keep looking back, hoping that I will see Mushim coming after me in his horse and buggy. When will I see them again? Where am I going? I have another one I forgot about. This is a new one. I love spring. I don't like winter so much. You all know that. So this is, then I'll read the final one. This is Spring Comes Slow to North Country. The prairie chicken dances the sun towards its northernmost summer home, a slow dance. Pale March light filtered through bare birch limbs offers little heat. The bleak wind brittle as mica. The ice-locked lake begins to moan, a low rumbling, the sound of thunder coming. Ice vibrates like a drumhead, sings so loud it wakes me up. Spring comes slow to North Country. Ice rain stings our faces. Winter-weary bodies crave sun's warmth. First thunder wakes the sleeping earth. Sap begins to flow, calls the snakes. Loons wail, geese returned. How I mourned their leaving 7 months ago. I don't know if anyone lives by a lake. Have you heard the lake when it freezes up? And when it thaws out in the summer and we get booms and pings and crashes and all kinds of cool sounds. So how many of you? Oh, this is Thunderbird. So this was a cool thing that Dr. Suzanne Kelly suggested that I put my art, my birch bark biting art, into a chapbook of poems. I would never have thought to do that. So I showed her students in her class how to do birch bark biting. That's an old Ojibwe art. We bite using our eye teeth, and I'm able to do that. I have good teeth, still so far, and then this was made on like a 140-year-old press, where you get the block of wood and put the words in it on the block of wood, and then the big round press, and the students did all the work and so on. So there was only 312 of these, so they've all sold out. So this was really a cool book to do. So how many of you have seen the Northern Lights lately? They've been going bonkers yeah. So of course, most Native people in the Northern Hemisphere have sayings about the Northern Lights. Ours is that you can't whistle at the Northern Lights or they'll come down and choke you. So like my mom said, I whistled at them, but I ran right back in the house really fast. And I was up in Homer, Alaska, and there's a Inupiat poet there And she said her people believe that if you whistle at them, they'll come down and take your head and use it as a ball to play ball up in the heavens with it. So you don't whistle at night. So this is a participatory poem. You have to participate. How to send the Northern Lights back after you whistle at them. To send them back, take your thumbnail and click outward quickly from behind your front teeth. Okay, everybody? If you're still lucky to have them. So if you don't have any teeth, you can use your zipper. When they first come down, begin rubbing your fingernails against each other. And you will hear a sound like wind blowing through dried leaves on trees. It's the voices of Wawate trying to communicate with the people on earth. You should always answer in a whispering voice. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was really lovely. What a wonderful range of poems, and we look forward to the publication of your novel, which apparently is almost finished. So, a couple of things. Yesterday, you borrowed a sheet of paper from me because a poem came to you.
Yeah.
So, I need that paper back, but
You're not getting it back.
So, how does it work? You were just here, and you suddenly wanted to write.
Yeah. So when you're hanging around poets or writers, anything you say we can take, and you can't say nothing about it. So I've been listening to snippets of conversations and things that were said and things that were said during the presentation, and I don't know where I'm going to go with it yet, but I sort of have an idea. So I can't tell you what I wrote because I have to.
But it came from sounds and things you were listening to.
Yeah.
You know, in the ancient world, Homer, for example, would invoke the muse, that he believed that he himself could not write the epic of the Iliad. Only the divine could speak through him, and so the beginning of the poem was "Sing in me, muse," or etc. Do you accept that notion, or where does your inspiration come from?
Yes. Well, it comes from, like I said, mostly me as being a Native person, living in North Dakota or Portland, or something happened that's never happened to me before while I was writing the Tree Popping Moon. Writing a poem, you just write. Sometimes things happen. I do research writing a poem, and sometimes really cool things happen, and I'll stand up and go, wow, that was so cool, the ending of that poem, and then you're like, shut up and get back to work, but I can celebrate. But writing a novel, which I never thought I could do, it started out as a 700-word picture book, because there's only 2 picture books in the United States about boarding schools. There's a lot more in Canada. And I belong to several writers' groups, and they all said, no, this needs to be a chapter book or a middle grade novel. It's like, I can do a 700-word picture book, I can do a poem. But they said, take every paragraph that you put in your picture book and just plump it out. So that's what I've been doing for the last 2 years. And it's working pretty well. I'm shocked myself, 30,000 words compared to 10 words in a poem. But a cool thing has happened is that these 2 main characters, Joseph and Sonny, they've been coming and talking to me. So I don't know if it's a muse or if you think I'm all crazy, but they won't let me sleep at night until I get up and write what they're telling me that they want to do. Like, they wanted to run away from boarding school, and my father didn't run away from boarding school, so I wasn't going to put it in the book. They wouldn't let me sleep until I wrote about them running away from boarding school. They wanted to go to the ocean. These are 2 prairie boys that wanted to go to the ocean, and when I did research about Chemawa, they did bring kids on field trips. So I wrote about them going to the ocean. Recently, I was driving to Watford City, and Joseph got in my head, and he said, when I come home from boarding school, I want to go through a healing ceremony. And we do have a healing ceremony, wipe away your tears, that I wrote about then, because he talked to me. So I've heard other poets, like Louise Erdrich, some of you know her work. She's a good friend, so she was going to write a book about boarding schools. I've been pleading with her. And sometimes she sends me her manuscript. So one of the books, I can't remember which one it was, she sent it to me, and I went and visited her, stayed with her in Minneapolis. And I said, what happened, Louise? There's nothing about the boarding school. Well, I was writing about it, and then they took me in a different direction. And at that time, I thought, well, wait a minute, who's writing this book? You know, you are. You tell those characters where they're going to go. But they told her where they wanted to go. And now I understand, because these boys are talking to me in my head. So I need them to talk about another 291 more words.
So, okay, let me get this straight. So you're in your house, ready to go to bed, or maybe in bed, and then voices,
Yeah, they're
discernible voices,
the boys, yeah.
And you can't ignore them,
No,
get into your head,
Yeah.
and they speak to you in a way that
Yes.
you know what they're saying.
yeah.
And this happens repeatedly, even when you're driving.
Well, it's been about 3 times now that, yeah. So they've left me alone for a couple months. So I thought, oh, good, I'm done with the book. And then he writes to me that and then the other thing he wanted too was the headmaster, he says the headmaster, I want the headmaster to come in and bring a bunch of people, because the headmaster wants to show how assimilated we are in his working in the carpentry shop. So I just start writing. Yeah, it's easy to write, the headmaster coming in. Then I decided that these people will come from the Elks Lodge in Salem. So then I look up information about the Elks Lodge, and they were there in 1925. And then, so when they comes in, and the headmaster says, these are people from the Elks Lodge, well, Sonny has hunted elk back in the Turtle Mountain, and he goes to himself, Elks Lodge, elks don't have a lodge, they don't live in a lodge. So just fun things like that just pop up as like, wow, I don't know where that came from. It had to come from Joseph, not Sonny, but Joseph told me that story. So then I just write it down.
So you're in bed, and
I'm asleep. They wake me up.
you have to. They wake you up, and you have to get up and go to a piece of paper and write it down. Then, otherwise, you can't sleep.
Yeah.
And this wasn't a lifelong thing. This is recent.
This is new for writing this novel. Yeah, it's a new experience for me. But
Do you
I think
like
it's pretty
it, or
cool.
is it annoying?
I think it's pretty cool. It's wonderful, because I wouldn't have thought of those things. I didn't think of him going to the ocean or running away. I wasn't going to it wasn't in my story until they wouldn't let me sleep.
And there's no way to shut it off.
No.
Wow, this is very fascinating. So
I know. It is to me too.
I mean, you must be a little surprised by this.
I love it. It is surprising. Yeah. But if I hadn't have seen other writers put that like on Facebook, or there's a Mona Susan Power that just came out with a most incredible book called The Council of Dolls. Oftentimes she'll put on Facebook about her characters, talking to her. So I didn't feel entirely crazy. I know it does happen to writers.
Yeah, but lots of writers say, "Oh, this, the character spoke to me," or the character. But you're saying they actually spoke to you. I mean, it's not just some sort of metaphor, is it?
Well, they were in my head. We want to run away. We want to go to the ocean, because prairie boys. It made sense. They're from the prairie. They'd never seen the ocean.
Let's talk about Canada for a minute. So first, in South Africa, there were Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that Mandela and others created, and they were quite successful. And then Canada has adopted Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and I've seen some of them at the Human Rights Museum up in Winnipeg, and they're extraordinarily moving and powerful and heartbreaking. Talk a little bit about that process. What do we mean by Truth and Reconciliation Commissions?
I had the wonderful opportunity of going up to Whitehorse, Yukon, with the commissioners, Chief Willie Littlechild, Maria Wilson, and Chief Justice Murray St. Clair. I was one of the international observers to their process of truth-telling. And what really mentioned at supper was reconciliation is a long ways out there. They were just telling the truth. They were taking down the survivor stories of what happened to them at boarding school. And he talked about, first we had to reconcile with ourselves. If you read the last chapter of my book, Stringing Rosaries, it's about my father. And I had to forgive him for the way we were raised. He became an alcoholic, and a fairly violent alcoholic. I ran away. He beat us the way he was beaten at boarding school. We were disciplined that way. Mama was made to kneel on broomsticks for discipline. She had us girls kneel in the corner, not on a broomstick. So we were never hugged, or we were never said, "I love you." So I had to forgive my parents for the way, and they had already passed away, for the way we were raised. And the healing that came to me out of this. It's called My Healing Journey, the last chapter. So it's a remarkable process that they did in Canada. So in the United States, we're calling the act the Truth in Healing Act. So since Kamloops, it's only been 2 years that this has made national and international news, especially here in the United States. We haven't started the truth-telling yet. This book is part of the truth-telling. So the cool thing now is that the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, which I was one of the founding members of back in 2011, and that's what we were working to bring the issue to Congress, to a national attention, but it took Kamloops, Secretary Deb Haaland in place, the Boarding School Healing Coalition in place, before it's starting to make a national, being aware at a national level. And so they have the Truth in Healing Act. And I like healing better than reconciliation. I think that's a long ways off. And what does that mean? So that act is going through Congress as we speak now. The Boarding School Healing Coalition people are testifying with Deb Haaland and Elizabeth Warren. So the commission would be a commission of people, and they go throughout the United States and take testimony and ask, what does healing look like for boarding school survivors? So we're just now starting the truth-telling. And the cool thing is that the Boarding School Healing Coalition just won $1 million or a multi-million-dollar grant from the government to organize a oral historian project. And they've hired a lady to run that project, and I'm being interviewed to be one of the oral historians, because that's what I did. I think I'm one of the first people that did something like this, to document boarding school survivors' stories. So it's what I do. So I hope I get the job. I hope I get the job if they're listening. I have a final interview coming up. But then as a team, we'll go throughout certain states, because there are some states that didn't have boarding schools, but we'll go as a team and we'll archive and interview survivors. Because like the people I interviewed said, please tell the world what happened to us. Some of them wanted to remain anonymous. They didn't want their families to know what happened to them. It's like, I went through hell, and I have to think about it every day. I don't want my kids and my grandkids to ever know what I went through. So some of them are anonymous. So there's a lot of care that we need to take when we interview survivors. But it's the same thing with Holocaust survivors. They're starting to pass away. The world should never forget what happened. We should never forget what happened to boarding school survivors.
Or what's happening right now in Gaza and in Israel. So in Canada, where I've heard some of these interviews, you go into a booth and you can watch them. And so the person who survived the boarding schools speaks often to people who were teachers or principals or whatever, and it often involves an enormous amount of emotion.
Yeah.
And the heartbreak and the pain, the rage. But when it's over, there's often a kind of a catharsis that getting that off your chest in front of somebody who abused you really does seem to have something of a healing effect. Do you believe that?
Yeah, we say that we're only as healthy as our secrets. So there are still some people, mostly men, that one man, he said, my boarding school story will stay back here. And oftentimes it can lead to alcohol and drug abuse or even suicide. So we're only as healthy as our secrets. So we have to take care with those that can't or don't want to tell their story, because it is so traumatizing. And when someone does tell a story and these stories come unstuffed, because oftentimes they've never told anybody. A lot of them said, I've never told anybody my boarding school story. So when stories start coming unstuffed, you need therapists and counselors, medicine people, psychiatrists, psychologists there to help support them. After the Truth in TRC would leave a community, they would keep people there for a week, because things could still come unstuffed with the survivors. So we have to be careful also with those that are recording the stories to deal with secondary trauma. But we have to be very careful when we interview the elders, just because of that, because we can re-traumatize them as they tell their stories.
So just a reality check, and then I want to turn to the audience. But some Native people, some indigenous people who've been to boarding schools had what they regard as good experiences, right? It's not 100% bad. That there are people who would say, I went and it was useful to me, and I'm glad I went, and so what do you make of that?
Yeah, I've been told that a lot, or not a lot, but I've told that off or sometimes. But so what I see when I interview these people and they say that is that often they have seen the beatings of their cousins or relatives or sisters or the other kids, so they kind of behave in a way that doesn't bring attention to them. It's a survival mode. So they get treated differently by the nuns or by the headmasters or by the matrons because they're trying to behave so that what happens to what they see, the trauma of what they, because they're often in secondary trauma too, so they are treated differently. But it's a survival mode that they have. And most of the elders, some of the elders that I say, that talk to me and say they had a good time because they, like my father became a carpenter, so he did make a living for us. We were poor, but at the same time, he was brilliant. He could do math. He was incredible. He was my dictionary, my encyclopedia when I was in high school. So could he have gone on and gotten a master's and a doctorate? I think, hell yeah. So, but they were only encouraged to only become carpenters, bricklayers, tinsmithers, shoemakers, and so on. Could they have gone to different degrees in universities if they hadn't been only encouraged to be farmers, and mostly the women were just trained to be housewives?
So are you saying that people who witness a relatively good experience probably do have secondary traumas that have not yet surfaced?
I think so.
Yes.
I can't prove that. It wasn't part of the questions that I asked them, but I think they would have, yeah. Because I don't think, and they witnessed sexual abuse. They witnessed the horrible verbal abuse, yeah. So they were just treated. Someone said, "Well, you're saying they were sellouts," and I go, "Well, hell no, they weren't. They weren't sellouts. They were survivors. They were doing everything they could to survive. So they just had a different experience in boarding school from those that rebelled or acted out."
I talked to Dennis Banks a couple of years ago. You probably know him, and he talked about being in the schools and kneeling on a broomstick.
Yeah.
So go into a room with a very solid floor, put down a broomstick, and then kneel on it so that it's right in the crook of your knee.
Yeah.
He said, try that. Go home and try that for 15 minutes.
Yeah.
He said that alone is a form of abuse and torture.
Yeah.
And this is just one of many, many, many techniques used routinely.
Yeah, that's it. It's a stress torture. You would use that in the army or during war. It's called a stress torture. And some of them even had to circle and put their nose in it while they're kneeling on the broomstick or hold their hands out. One gentleman had to kneel on the broomstick, and little boy, so he would kind of sit back down on his knees, and the priest would grab him by the back of his neck and make him, sit back up on his knees. He never spoke his language in public again. He recently died of COVID a couple years ago. So sad. But he said that whenever the tribe would ask him to say a prayer or so on, he wouldn't do it because all he could feel was that grip behind his head when he had to kneel down because he was caught speaking Dakota.
How much sexual abuse was there? Enormous amounts, some?
I think
it depends.
I think there's an enormous amount. If they weren't being abused, they were watching it happen. Yeah.
Thoughts or questions or comments? We have a little bit of time. Rachel, I'll come to you. Wait, Mary, right down here, yeah. Start here.
I was just wondering how your oral history work informs your poetry.
Most of my boarding school poems are just about my family. So the one book, Bitter Tears, these are vignettes that I've heard from people that I've interviewed that they would tell me a little bit, but they didn't want to tell me any more. So like the broomstick, that was a story that was told to me, redacted. So these are little vignettes that was told to me by boarding school survivors, but they didn't want to interview. So probably be writing more, especially if I go out and start hearing boarding school stories.
Mary?
Hi there. I have a quick question for you. Really, and it may not be quick, but how do you go from your parents were assimilated to you to not being, wipe all the Indian away, and now you want it? How do you can you make sense of that in terms of what do you think your parents might be thinking? They're like, oh my gosh, we did this for whether they wanted to or not, going the reverse, and going back to what your parents were and your ancestors.
My parents moved back to the reservation before I did. I was so proud of them. So I always like to tell Richard Pratt, haha, it didn't work. Our parents went back to the res. And a lot of Native people could not make a living in the city. So Papa started his own carpenter business, and Mom became a tribal historian. So when I moved back, like I said in my poem, I started dancing. And when you dance, you learn a lot about that sacred circle. You go through ceremony to get your spirit name so that you have the right to wear a plume. The songs, I started going to sweat lodge ceremonies, Sundance, so talking to elders. So I just was on this long journey, and still am, to find who I am as a Native person, as an Ojibwe person. So it's been since I was 19, 20 years old, and I'm in my early 70s. So I'm still learning. But that's the path I chose. My brother and sister didn't. They stayed in the city, and they never knew a whole lot of who they were as Native people. But Mama and Papa, they came back home, and they were very proud of my dancing and the work I did, and becoming a teacher and staying on the reservation teaching. So I started teaching dance. I taught outfit making. I can't sing, that's the only thing. I can't teach a song, singing, but just going to ceremonies and doing everything I could to learn who I was as a Native female.
Other questions or thoughts over here? Thank you, Mary.
Thanks. So I actually have two questions. The first one is for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission offered 95 calls to action. I assume you don't have all 95 memorized. However, what types of calls to action would you like the United States government to implement here? And then my second question, there is and was and has been a big problem within the historical profession in Canada with certain historians saying that there was not a genocide, and certain historians and lay historians saying that, or completely denying the graves at residential schools. Mm-hmm. Would you be worried about the same thing happening here?
Yeah, I see that mostly on Twitter about the denial of residential school issues, and that's when the res in me comes out, and I just want to bust him in the face. That would be the easiest thing to do. I just ignore that. I can't deal with that. I can't, because of my deep knowledge of the hell that our people were put through, and there isn't one person, Native person in the United States, that hasn't been affected by boarding school. So I just ignore that. I don't really care if it happens here in the United States, because we're going to record the stories. Yeah, one of those 94, what were they called? 94 calls to action was the Pope apology from the Pope. I think that was like 59, and by golly, he did.
He did it.
He went up to Canada and apologized there. But then I wonder, does that kind of filter through to the United States? Does that cover us here too, or does he have to come and make an apology to us? We haven't addressed that, and it's not being addressed like with NABS or anything like that. But it was important for a lot of people, for their personal healing, to apologize. What I like to see, we need to ask. Every community is different. I think TJ, we're all different. We're all different in our point of view about land and how we lived and so on. Every tribe is different. So I think every tribe needs to come up personally with their community what healing from boarding school trauma looks like. So for my tribe is about 95% Catholic. So would that be a novena, church ceremony? What would that look like? So we need monies to flow into every community for boarding school healing. I was visiting with, my healing personally has been, someone asked me, this has been a lot of therapy, mostly because of having a violent alcoholic father. So I've had a lot of therapy, a lot of counseling. My spirituality is very strong, so I'm good there. But what does that look like for an individual, and then their family, and then the community they live in, and the tribe, and then nationally? So we still have a lot of work to do to find out what does that look like. And that's what we're hoping this commission will do, is because it's Boarding School Healing Coalition. What does healing from boarding school trauma look like nationwide? But to me, it's individual, family, and tribe, and then state and national. So we have a long ways to go and a lot of work to do to see what that looks like.
I just want to return to this idea. So after years of doing the Truth and Reconciliation interviews and so on in Canada, and multi-volumes of the findings and video and so on, then there were these 95 recommendations. And I just urge everyone, when you go home, to Google this and to read through them. They're extraordinary. And some of them are relatively doable.
Yeah.
And some of them are going to be a lot harder. But after all of listening to all of this for years, then this commission, made up mostly of Native peoples, said, well, these are the 95 things that need to happen in Canada for this to be a healthy society of several different types of nations. And it's really a remarkable document. Do you think the bill will pass here?
Now that Trump is out, I think it will. Yeah, it didn't go anywhere last year, but now that
You think it will?
Biden's in there, I think
How
it will
important
pass.
is the fact that we now have, for the first time in American history, a Native Secretary of the Interior?
Yeah, well, she's remarkable, and her family is boarding school survivors also, so she's deeply involved in the issue personally, along with nationally. Yeah, like I said, for her to be in place, the Boarding School Healing Coalition, and my book, it just was this perfect storm of events that came into being at the same time. So it's remarkable. Yeah, I mean, she's head of the Department of Interior, and the Department of Interior, the ones that ran these boarding schools, the federal boarding schools, along with giving monies for 14 Christian denominations to run the schools. So there's no separation of church and state. You know, when my father went to Chimawa, he was forced into choosing a church, or he wouldn't eat. He said they wouldn't feed us if we didn't go to church, so it's forced Christianity. At Fort Taunton, I think it's the Grey Nuns. I'm going to be doing more research on Fort Taunton. I think it was the Grey Nuns that came in there and helped, you know, the classes and so on. So there's no such thing as separation of church and state in the boarding schools.
Is there any other thought over here? Yes, back here. Rachel. We'll take about another 5 minutes, everybody. So.
I just want to say thank you so much for your honesty. And I was wondering if writing your poetry, does that help you with your healing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's what I said in introductory comments, is it's been totally therapeutic. Someone even asked me, my first book especially, is pretty raw. I write a lot about the abuse and my father and so on. They said, well, aren't you embarrassed to put that out there? And I said, no, because when I would write that poem and it's published and it's in that book, it's like it's not on me anymore. It's out there. That book is closed, and it's been so healing. I've done grief workshops, poetry writing workshops, to help write with grief and trauma. So it's totally been my sanity, has been writing my poetry, absolutely. Along with, like I think I started to say, a lot of therapy. I was visiting with one, I have trouble with my lungs and pneumonias and stuff, and visiting with my lung doctor, and he said he was also a psychiatrist. And I thought, what? This is in Fargo. But I said, do you work with Native people in Fargo? And he says, yeah. And I said, do you know anything about boarding schools? And he said, no. So for me, one of the big things, one of my 95 things would be to train psychiatrists and psychologists and counselors and school counselors and so on in boarding school trauma, so that they could help people, Native people. Because I think some Native people, I think they don't even know that they're in trauma. They've just lived with it all their lives. They don't know what that means, that they're suffering from what happened to them in boarding school, or their parents, what happened to their parents, or even grandparents. When I talk to Native students that are in the audience at colleges, when they start telling their story that their grandparents told, they break down and just start weeping. So we're in that intergenerational trauma and historical trauma. There's something called epigenetics that somebody else would have to explain more about that, but it's in the DNA. I think of my great-grandma, who I knew, the one that was in Cannonball. My uncle, who was 97 when he passed away a couple of years ago, I would go sit by him for 2 weeks at a time. I would just sit there for 2 weeks and wait till he wanted to tell a story. And he said, yeah, she was kind of mean, my great-grandma. And I asked him, I said, well, how come she was mean? Because she had what's called a pugamagon, which is a war club, and she would hang it on her belt, and she'd whap whoever got in her way. I said, go, Grandma. And he thought for a minute, and he said, she saw Indian wars. So great-grandma seeing Indian wars, and then being put on reservation, sending her 4 sons to boarding school, and then sending my mom to boarding school, so that the DNA from that trauma is, I'm sure it's in me, and I pass it on to my kids and my grandkids, and now my 3 great-grandbabies. So we have to learn more about that, about the epigenetics and the trauma that's handed down through. And that research comes out of Holocaust survivors.
So Denise, just 2 more things. And thank you so much for your lovely poetry and your candor. We're just so pleased to end our long day with your wisdom and your voice. Many institutions around the country are adopting land acknowledgement statements. Mm-hmm. So if we were doing it here, we'd say something like, this is land that was historically Mandan Hidatsa land. We're talking about it.
Who's supposed to do that?
Yeah.
Where's Chris?
But talk a little bit about that. What's the use of these land acknowledgements? I talked to a Hopi man about it, and he said, sure, you're giving the land back too?
That's what I was just going to say. Just give us the land back. Yeah, sir, that's what, well, first when it first came out, I thought, well, that's pretty cool. And now I see more academics, Native academics, saying that it doesn't mean much to us. Just give us the land back.
So it's sort of self-soothing for the people that do it.
Yeah.
So last question, and don't answer it if you don't feel like it, of course, but, for a long period, Native peoples were either pressed heavily to assimilate or decided to assimilate because they thought it was the best way forward. This is a different time, and you said you have been searching for your own identity and trying to figure out who you are and where you fit and so on. Do you think that North Dakota in our time gives you enough space to do that? I mean, what are the constraints for you now of trying to be authentically whatever you wish to be? Is there a repression? Is there, in what sense is there an intimidation factor even now in North Dakota life?
I just take the space that I need. I'm not feeling that in any sense. I think that the only time I was fearful to be Native in North Dakota was the morning after Trump was elected. I mean, there's racism in North Dakota. I know when I was at NDSU, the Native students were counseled to not have tribal license plates because we could be targeted. It's called DWI, driving while Indian. And there was a study that came out in Moorhead that showed that Native people were targeted for driving, getting picked up for whatever reason. I was stopped once for no reason at all, was let go. But I call it, we call it driving while Indian. So there is a fear that I'm aware of where I'm at often and careful. But mostly with Trump being president is the first time I think I felt real fear for being Native and for our people in North Dakota. But in general, there's still discrimination. There's still microaggressions that I'm aware of, and yeah, there's still things that can hurt, and you just wonder, what was that? Was that racism or microaggression, or should I ignore it? Yeah.
So is it fair to ask for one encore poem?
Oh, geez. Anybody reading my books that want me to read something?
You choose.
Well, some of you have been, oh, I did, okay. Maybe I'll look for the new. Okay, well, this is something that happened at Fort Taunton. Wow, maybe I should look for a lighter one. Something not so so heavy. You're laughing. What's the name of it? Some of them I. 52. And which? Oh, okay, oh yeah, that's a short one. It's a haiku. Prairie Drive. Hawk perched on hay bale, patient, watching for field mice. Traffic careens by.
Denise Lajimodiere.
Yeah.